So for the next 6 weeks, we're going to walk through the first 6 chapters of Daniel. It's all narrative story. Yes, I'm stopping before I get to the apocalyptic stuff. And so you're going to know a lot of these stories. It's interesting. I was getting ready for this, and I started reading the last 2 chapters. I did not remember, really hardly at all. And so I hope that as we tell these stories, because I'm going to do more telling than reading the passage to you, okay? Like today's passage is 20 some odd verses. Next week is 49. You don't want me to read you 49 verses. I don't want to read you 49 verses. And so if you want to prep ahead, start reading the first 6 chapters of Daniel. So when Daniel opens, it tells us that Nebuchadnezzar has come and defeated Israel. Jehoiakim, who's the king of Israel at the time, was not a good king. It tells us not only did Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians take over Jerusalem, but that God gave them over. A covenant God who had a promise to Israel, knew that Israel needed correction. It sounds a lot like the stories through the Judges. And we're going to see God's faithfulness even to his covenant here in just a moment. But all of a sudden, when you start looking at this, it wasn't like God just defeated Israel. There's this piece of context where the Babylonian gods and the God of Yahweh, the God of Israel, are really at odds. Just stay right there, Sharon. I'll be right to the center of the picture in a second. So can you imagine if somebody came and took over Holly Hill and they carried our candles off and they carried this cross off that's in front of the pulpit, and they carried them off and they put them in place in front of the Babylonian gods. And all of a sudden when you start to think about that, all the stuff that is sacred to them, whatever it is that you think about the baptistry, the cross, the offering plates, the candles, and it's put in front of a foreign god. Not make me happy. And that's exactly what happened in the first 2 verses of Daniel. All the people are put into that situation. And that's how we find the beginning of Daniel. And it's that conflict is going to be in the background for the whole book, that moment and that place. Y'all, we live in a post-Christian America. And you say, now, John, that's a challenging statement. We live in the Bible Belt, right? You up and down. Head up and down. All right. It has to be interactive with me, y'all. I'm used to conversations. Y'all have talked to me enough already. I'm still trying to get Howie to pay me by the word. He fled out of the bank the other day when I said that. I heard y'all snickering back there. But now let me just tell you why I say that. So in the Bible Belt, right here in Holly Hill, the percentages of people that go to church continues to dwindle. The older you are, the higher the percentage. Okay? But for my age, right around us, it is less, so I'm 55, less than 50% of the people are regular attenders of church. When I get to my children's age and younger, so my kids are 27 and 22, it's barely 10%. And that starts looking like post-Christian America. Okay? Those are the numbers in where you live, in your zip code. You can spread that out. It still works in Utahville and Vance and Somerville or wherever you want to place yourself. Because that's true really for all of South Carolina and the Southeast as a whole. Every time there's a spot where you can go run those things and see them. And by the way, they define regular church attendance much more liberally than I do. It's probably about one time a month. And so here is Daniel and his friends in that place. And so Nebuchadnezzar, as part of the way he would normally do things, they would then look for the brightest, the smartest, and bring them into the king's court. Okay? Verses 3 and 5, it says, I want you to go find the fine-looking men. Okay? They look like they fit on the cover of a magazine. It's interesting when you read those verses, it talks about their appearance before their ability. But I want them to also be smart. I want them to have all of the stuff. Nebuchadnezzar, he sends his man out and he says, I want you to find these people and bring them in, and we're going to train them up over the next 3 years so that they may be part of this court, and we'll have some of their culture and we'll have some of their wisdom. And that's where we find Shadrach, oh boy, about to jump, where we have Daniel, see if I can get my words right, where we find Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. They're found to be good looking, no defects, smart, able to learn. They're young, and they're brought into Nebuchadnezzar's court to be found this way. And so in the midst of this and all of this, we start to see a covenant God who is already still working in their lives. This is verses 3 through 6, roughly, if you're trying to follow the story. And then all of a sudden, it's interesting to me, they're told to be given new names in verse 6. Daniel becomes Belshazzar. I probably mispronounced that. Hananiah, I am reading on the wrong lines. We end up with Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They all take Babylonian names. They're now a part of that culture. It's nothing unusual. Many times people who move to our country, we look at them a lot like I look at these Hebrew names and go, how do you say that? And so they take new names and start to work into the culture so that it's easier for them and they don't have to worry about how they say a name or how somebody says their name. And so it was with them. They take new names and start to become part of the country. They're also put aside to see how they're going to do. They're going to be in a contest about who gets to be chosen, because they're not the only ones to come into the country. So let me pick up and I want to read you verses 8 and 9. So there's a royal official who's given them new names. And it says, yet Daniel resolved not to defile himself with royal food and wine. He asked the chief official, he says, do we have to take this? The chief official probably is also somebody who's been taken into captivity as well, who doesn't really isn't Babylonian by peace. Chief official isn't interested in this. He realizes it's a risk for him, it's a risk for them, and yet for some reason he allows them to do that. Now, I don't know exactly what it was that was defiling. It's possibility that the food and the things that they're going to be given was brought to the Babylonian gods as a part of sacrifice. It's a possibility that the things that they were being brought was against the Old Testament law. It was unclean. Or maybe Daniel is just upset because many times in our world, the ability to have food and water and those things that most of the time we take for granted is a sign of privilege and power. And he knows his people are doing without. And he doesn't want to defile himself while his people don't have. I don't know, it doesn't tell us, but there's something that Daniel realizes that he's being asked to do and it doesn't fit what he believes. He realizes that he's caught in those moments of this is okay. This is where God has told me to live, and I can live in this sphere and I can function in this place. And this is what it means to be faithful. In this spot of, well, everybody else says you can live here. And it's okay, John. Oh, might we find ourselves with those quandaries in life? You should bob your head up and down now. We do. And that's what it means all of a sudden when we're facing and how we live in our culture. And how we try to live that out. I want to make sure I get verse 9 right. He says, now God had called the official to show favor. I promise you I will not do Hebrew all the time. It's a struggle for me. Show favor there is hesed. It says God's blessing, God's hesed has been poured out so that Daniel can live in faith. God's hesed lives out in a couple of ways. It's about Him pursuing us when we don't understand it, similar to prevenient grace. It also means that God's protection and blessing is upon us. It clearly shows us that all of a sudden in verse 9 that God is at work in Daniel's life and in Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That God's hesed, His blessing, somebody who's trying to follow Him, a covenant God is still living into that. A God who has promised to deliver. Last week when I was off, I knew this was coming and I was thinking how much and how vital it was that God's blessing is poured out on us. To walk in that, to live in that. Because He's at work even before I know it. Before I realize it. Even when I'm unfaithful, He's still faithful. And so Daniel and the guys are feeling that. It's interesting, tells us in verse 10, that officially he goes, I don't know about this. Can you imagine this conversation? He goes, if I get found out and you guys show up skinny and weak, kings have a tendency to chop people's heads off, y'all, at this time. That's what he's risking. When it says God had persuaded him, that God had worked in him, he's like, if y'all show up in 10 days in front of the king, and for some reason it's obvious, because y'all going to be hanging out together. Y'all going to be one group, right? And they're going to be like, what's different with him? He finds out I've been feeding you broccoli and cauliflower and water and not wine and the fatted calf. I'm in trouble now. Yet God was working. And Daniel looks at him, he goes, just 10 days. Just 10 days. Let's see how we look. Let us see what is right with who we are and see where we stand. tells us in verse 15, it says at the end of the 10 days they looked healthier, better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. They were eating the fatty stuff. My figure would have been good in that court, okay? Yes, I hear y'all laughing behind me back there. Not only that, but they are shown to be smarter than others, learning faster. And also, and it's going to be very vital for next week, it's going to tell us that Daniel can interpret and understand dreams. Now, I don't think any of us is about to be carried off and given new names and live in a world that we're not supposed to be. But the reality is we are living in a world where somebody is saying, John, I want you to live in this spot because everybody's doing it. And yet our Christian culture says, and our belief system says, wait a second. We're supposed to live this way. I kept asking myself over the last 2 weeks, I'm like, so what are some of those things that get me? There is this sense of consumerism. We see it in the church today. We ask, and I probably have lived in this, I know I've seen it as a pastor, where we go, well, what can a church do for me? That's consumer. What can I take from it? Versus what is God asking me to do? You remember how I started announcements? Or one of the pieces I gave you? I asked you if you were interested, God had kind of prompted you or poked you about serving in an area. I asked you to write it on your sheet. That's the opposite of consumerism. It's that living that faith out. Somewhere I have a cell phone up here. It's back there. We got to either have the brightest and the best, or we have to always stay connected, which is a challenge in Holly Hill. Everybody want, yeah. All of you bobbing your heads now. But yet, what does it mean that just for a moment to be disconnected? Yesterday, I went to it was fun to go do something I love to do. To hunt. Kay's like, you got a spot, get out of the house. I want to see you. But do you know what? I still carried my cell phone in the middle of that. And I still checked the thing in the middle of watching for a deer. I couldn't put it down long enough to be disconnected to the world, where I know one of the spots that God talks to me and lets me be who I am is there. Our world says that's all good. But everything about what God has said, and by the way, every time I get in a personality thing, they're like, so how are you caring for yourself? How are you actually shutting down? Now, I don't know what yours is. I know that's one of mine. So it's easy for me to use. So what is it that God says you need to be living this way, and the world says it's okay to live this way? And if you can't think of something, I'd say you might need to check and see where the two spots are. Because there's lots of times that I find myself being pushed and pulled. Maybe it's keeping up with the neighbors. I'll give you another example of mine. We joked about this morning before church. I like being busy. I like going 120 miles an hour, knowing that I am running from the next place to the other. David Cantley is thinking, yep. Sorry, David. And yet sometimes I need to have a void in my schedule. Sometimes I need to have a spot where I do not have something to do. Because the world says I need to be busy. And the reality is, if you go over to the Psalms, he says, will you just be still so that you might hear my voice? Will you be quiet so that you can see and feel the Holy Spirit rolling over you? Will you shut that brain of yours down that's trying to run 90 miles an hour or 120 with your hair on fire. Because I can't get through because you're thinking about the next thing and racing to the next place. Where is it you need to engage your culture, but yet not be changed by it? Because see, God is calling us always to engage our culture. He does not call us to go get in a holy huddle and to stay in it by ourselves. That's why the Pharisees didn't understand when he invited all the sinners to meals or said he was going to their house. Because Jesus didn't believe in a holy huddle. He had a group around him. He walked with those disciples, but he engaged the culture. He engaged the people around him. And we ought to be impacting it. We ought to be impacting that culture that we walk in, which we live, but we shouldn't be changed by it. You're going to see over the next 5 weeks after this that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or the boys, are going to have to live into that Babylonian culture, and they're going to have to make a choice. Do I stand up or not? If you remember it, you know what's coming. The reality is we walk in that culture. The culture is asking us to change what we say, to change what we believe. So often I'm afraid that we have forgotten how God called us to live. Yes, he calls us to engage his culture, but he says, I want you to live in it and be who you are. You don't actually have to be confrontational about it. But when we start walking into our beliefs, who God has called us to be, when we walk into this spot and we are full of love and grace, we can engage this spot. And it's amazing to me when we do that. This side, our culture around us, they actually are amazed to see somebody walk in faith. Most of the time, they tend to respect it and to respond to it. Because when we engage our culture, just as Daniel did, he said, wait a second, that doesn't work for me. I'm supposed to live this way. When we're in that covenant relationship of walking with Christ as Christians, as followers of him, we start to engage the culture around us, and it's amazing to me we start to change it. Probably not because of us, but because of God's hesed is poured out on us. So this week, where's the culture pulling at you? Where's it trying to drag you into those in-between spots? And how should you respond back out of that? How should you be changed as a follower of Christ? How can you draw a boundary of I'm going to live this way, come back to I'm going to live this way and not this way. So my boundaries are important for understanding who I am and where I can't go. Yes, as Christians, we're called to engage the world around us. But we're also called to stay true to who we are, to a God who loves us. Ponder that for this week. Of where's the world trying to pull you from over here to over here. So that you can stay true to who you are and walking in his faith. Let me pray for you this morning. Lord, there's much about this piece today that is abstract. It's gray, it's fuzzy. Lord, I ask for your Holy Spirit to take us and lead us, that we might see where our boundaries are, what it means to follow you. Help us to draw them. Help us to step back on the other side of the line so that we might live for you wherever we are every day. Amen.